we're going to be discussing Jacob Darwin Hamblin's Arming Mother Nature, the Birth of Catastrophic Environmentalism. And we have with us two discussants to talk about this. David Kinkela, who's from the history side, an associate professor of history at SUNY Fredonia in New York. And David's research focuses on the history of U.S. environmental politics in a global age. His first book, which was DDT and the American Century, came out in 2011. And it examines the interconnections between U.S. environmentalism and U.S. foreign policy surrounding DDT. And he's currently working on a new book project called An Island of Plastic, A History of Waste, Water, and Petrochemicals, which is going to historicize the transnational history of the largest environmental wasteland in the world, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Looking forward to reading that, David. And our other discussant is Robert Marzec, who's an associate professor in the Department of English at Purdue University in Indiana. His research interests include the relationship between literature, the environment, and the history of colonial and post-colonial culture. His book from 2007 is an ecological and post-colonial study of literature from Daniel Defoe to Salman Rushdie, as well as an edited volume that came out in 2011, Postcolonial Literary Studies, the First 30 Years. He's also currently an associate editor for the journal Modern Fiction Studies. So we're so glad to have both of you here to talk about this book today. And where I thought we could start, great. Where I thought we could start was talking about science fact and science fiction. And I mentioned to you both that I have recently heard a paper at the American Society for Environmental History in which the presenter made a point of saying that her case, which was about using nuclear warheads as bombs to improve the Panama Canal, sounded outrageous. And you know, after reading this book by Jake, it doesn't sound outrageous at all for the 1960s to have proposed using nuclear warheads to mine out a new Panama Canal. So it got me wondering, did this book make you think differently about the lines between science fact and science fiction? So we can start with Robert.
Okay. Well, in a way, there's, in my discipline, there's always, it's very difficult to draw the line between fiction and fact, because fiction, of course, narratives, different kinds of discourses, will generate the kind of reality that we find ourselves in. So part of the work that I do is that in the best works of fiction are those that reveal the patterns of thought that generate the realities that we find ourselves in. So it wasn't that the collection itself, the work itself, made me think differently and, say, shift certain forms of what I thought were fiction into the category of fact. It was more like a quantitative or a qualitative relationship to the difference between fact and fiction. So it was a matter of wholly reinterpreting the very idea of what this line is and how it operates. And there's a really interesting new book by Tim Melly. He's a professor of American Studies out at Miami University, and it's called The Covert Sphere. And he traces the indissoluble relationship between, say, Cold War realities and then Cold War fictions and mystifications. And so he talks, for instance, about the way in which certain forms of fiction, television fiction, even in Kabul, there was the U.S. Army gave money to start a television show called something like Eagle 4, which was loosely based on our 24 series. And it was an attempt through fiction to get into the heads of people in Afghanistan that the American security forces were to be something that we should espouse. They were supposed to be in all of the American fiction story because of this. So it's this fiction creates a certain pattern of thought that then generates the reality that we find ourselves in. Mm-hmm. But yes, there's a lot of material. There's a lot of good archival work in this book that I had not been aware of before, and it really is astonishing.
Dave.
Yes. So from my perspective, I was as I was reading this and sort of thinking about your sort of question about the Panama Canal. My work on chemical pesticide had a very sort of similar kind of scientific fantasy embedded in it, of sort of the use of the ways in which scientists, politicians were thinking about the use and application of pesticides. And sort of emerging at the same time was sort of this golden age of science fiction, right? In the 1940s and 1950s, sort of this sort of this sort of widening of this sort of genre of literature. But also, what was kind of interesting to me was sort of the ways in which Jake was sort of talking about sort of the sense of the global, right? And science fiction had this sort of sense not only of the future, but also sort of the scale of how people were sort of envisioning the world, right? And so this thing called outer space comes into play. And it was really sort of interesting the ways in which the scientists that Jake was writing about really sort of embedded, we're thinking about those same kind of things. So, I'm not a science fiction reader myself, but I think from, recent literature on how environmental historians are engaging with this, I think there was you know this better. I think you guys had a conference, 2012, about the sort of relationship between science fiction and environmental history. Mm-hmm. And then sort of, again, sort of going back to my earlier work on DDT, the sort of genre of the monster movies, Mothra and all these sort of Godzilla, all sort of emerge out of this particular moment in time that I think capture what Jake was trying to capture in the book.
Well, you brought up this global level thinking, or as he called it, the synoptic scale. In this book. So planetary level thinking. And of course, a lot has been made about planetary level thinking in terms of environmental history and where the environmental movement comes from, that you have the Earthrise picture, that you're seeing the Earth as a big blue sphere now. And I was wondering how you think Jake's dealing with synoptic thinking after World War II, where that fits in with environmental history as a whole. What we've thought about. Should it make us rethink anything about planetary scale and how people thought about planetary scale?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I really enjoyed sort of his take on this sort of global approach. When Don Worcester was writing Ends of the Earth, and he says the environmental movement started in the deserts of New Mexico with the explosion of the first atomic bomb, right? Jake sort of picks up on that sort of concepts and sort of thinks about the ways in which scientists, and the military were sort of thinking about how to fight a war on such a massive scale, and the ways in which to grapple with or attempt to change climates, attempt to change environments, and doing so through sort of sense of measuring environments, the sort of measuring component that he was talking about. And I think he sort of, as you mentioned, we sort of, through the sort of traditional sort of ethos of how the modern environmental movement came about, right? It's sort of that moment where Earthrise sort of is a symbol of a globe, that you can actually see it from afar, right? And that becomes this sort of moment where people actually thought about this thing called Spaceship Earth. But what this book tells us, I think, is that there are many, many people who are thinking about sort of the relationships between climate, environment on a much broader scale, and also the relationship between, right, the planet itself and the solar system that it resides in, right? So,
right. You have some comments there, Rob?
I think this issue of the synoptic scale is one of the most important elements of this book. There's a real need now to rethink the way that human subjectivity has developed over the course of, say, the last 4 centuries. I mean, humans as a species are now affecting the environment on a planetary scale, and previously this would have been impossible, and it would have been crazy to think such a thing. It would have been labeled as a kind of apocalyptic narrative, which is also something that deals with. So it puts the critic, the scholar, in the unusual position of thinking about how humans and how their subjectivity has changed, and how one needs to be very suspicious of these larger structural forces that are in play at any particular moment in history. I mean, there's much about the way in the book that certain forces are espousing a kind of doom and gloom, and how this is criticized by other environmental camps, and how the apocalyptic narrative gets criticized by conservative environmental camps. But at the same time, these very military and conservative camps are using larger structural forces to not only change the environment, but change the way that humans act as a species. I mean, no other species on the planet changes a planetary environment in this way. Humans have evolved into this species, and humans weren't always this kind of figure. I trace this back to the beginning of the British enclosure movement, where you have the first large-scale rearranging of an environment, which starts with the nation of England, and then England begins to transport this across the globe as it begins to colonize foreign territories. So this movement, this transformation of environment, this change in ecosystems, and in some cases it just utterly destroyed ecosystems, is a planetary event. And so this is very different from the way that humans related prior to this in other forms of cultural and social and political organization.
Absolutely. You move from that local, where you were on a local scale, to something that is entirely different in this very large scale changes. And they are thinking large scale. And that's what you certainly see in this book, is that they are thinking about how do we modify the climate of all of, Asia? How do we cause, earthquakes in all of South America? I mean, they want it to be specific, but they're thinking big.
Right.
They're thinking
also a
about
sort
it.
of question. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I was just sort of. It's also sort of a question, picking up on what Robert said, right? The enclosure movement, both the sort of questions of limits and the questions of limitlessness, right? That the ways in which these folks are thinking has this sort of real sort of global sort of limitlessness, but they're also discovering that there are limits to the kind of the things that they can do, and also sort of the sort of limits of the Earth's carrying capacity for the human species, right? Or sort of coming up to those kind of questions.
Well, I found that so interesting in the way he talks about how their discourse moves and shifts between that limit and limitlessness, in that, we can do it, we can change everything. And then when you're accused of changing something, no, well, we actually can't do that. That's beyond us.
Right.
And so you never quite know who's telling the truth. I mean, can they? Did they? There's always some line that in their speech they have to straddle between claiming they can do everything and yet saying they've done nothing. So.
Well, what I think really interesting. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Robert. Go ahead.
Robert, go ahead.
Okay. What I find interesting is the way in which the kind of attitude to these transformation of large geographical regions in the 60s, the way that Hamblin traces this out, where there was the military and the national security was all gung-ho about transforming entire environments, and there was not much of a criticism, except for maybe some camps from people like Barry Commoner. But then how towards the late 70s, during the Carter administration, he begins to unearth the way in which Carter started this concern about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, climate change, global warming, and then the way that this global transformation was downplayed by the people that were picked to do the research and present the documents to him, and the climate change report that came out, I think it was in 1983, 84. But now, in the wake of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 2007 report, the fourth assessment report that came out of it, the military, all branches of the Department of Defense have now kind of gone on a charm offensive, characterizing the environment as their new mandate, especially something like climate change. So the CNAS, which is a new security organization that was created, I think, in around 2005, 2006, held about a year after the IPCC report came out in 2007. In July of 2008, they held what was called a climate change war game, where in this game, and this was aired on ABC News. It was they had a number of scientists involved in the game. They had a number of policy leaders, military leaders, and ostensibly the game was orchestrated, or at least invited the public that was viewing the game to think that what you were seeing was a new concern on the part of the military for the environment. But the game had a particular direction that they wanted the players to go in. It was very much like the Rand Corporation's game theory, decision theory that talks about in his book.
Right.
And they wanted the game to go in a particular direction. They wanted not for people to think about sustainability. At a certain moment in the game, in fact, all the game players said that this sustainability, because they began the game by thinking, well, how can we change the way that we relate to the environment? How can we develop more sustainable technologies? But this became a kind of risk throughout the course of the game. And the game was geared towards security. It transformed environmental concern into something of security. So suddenly, adaptation became the new imperative. You must adapt to the situation. We must put adaptation measures into place to make sure that we are secure in terms of the coming eco-wars that will happen. So this what we've gone back now to is this concern for controlling large geographical regions, but in a kind of unidirectional way, with this particular end goal of just having climate change become a security issue, not an ecological issue.
Absolutely, and that's precisely what you see has roots in this military thinking about how you could change the climate, right? It's all about security and how you might manipulate climate and how you should be concerned about climate being manipulated from your side, which I found interesting in terms of the biodiversity question, how biodiversity becomes the way you have security. Is you're secure if you're diverse. And that is something that really struck me working in conservation. I work a lot with conservation biology type issues and where they come from and what has happened. And that struck me as very interesting, that then biodiversity is actually about military security and economic security, which is where it's come back to now with talks of ecosystem evaluations and valuations that you put money on ecosystem services. So it's become a security issue again. And Dave, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to pick up a little bit on two comments. One, just picking up what Robert said. So when the U.S. military comes out in support of global warming, right? This thing is real. It was almost this really interesting political moment within the United States, is the sort of debate about who's causing climate change and what are the sort of impacts of climate change going to happen, right? That it became this moment where, if the military believes it, then it's real, right? If the military are planning for climate change, then, well, this thing is happening. And it's interesting, after reading Jake's book, how sort of throughout this sort of narrative of the late 20th century, how involved the military were in all of these sort of weather-related, either measuring or trying to change weather or climates. So that sort of particular moment was kind of interesting to me. Robert, so thanks for bringing that up. The other thing that I sort of struck by reading this is, the more they know, the less they know, right? The more the sort of military and scientists know about different climates and sort of the global scale of climates and trying to change climates, the less they know. And it becomes a sort of question of why are there droughts in one part of the world and not in the other, and why is there rainy seasons in one, and who's causing, and there's sort of this sense of causation, like the Soviet Union or the US are sort of manipulating weather, right? But then the sort of suggestion that they don't have a sort of a baseline to sort of determine where what they refer to as normal climate, right? Because the climate has been so manipulated with this sort of with nuclear testing, right? So they can't really sort of determine what sort of the baseline that they're going to be measuring on for the rest of the 20th century. So I always thought that was kind of interesting, the way Jake weaved that sort of story through it about sort of knowing more, but in knowing more, they don't really know how to make sense of that, and sort of how weather's developed and how why drought arises and why there's unusual rainy seasons.
Yeah, and it's interesting to tease out the way in which it's a particular mode of intelligibility. It's a certain way of knowing that takes over. So you begin to overlook such things. And so for the longest time, the issue of biodiversity was just disappeared. It was not part of the conversation. Barry Commoner talks about this in the early 60s when he's criticizing the atomic warfare and the explosions that are taking place in the Pacific and how it's radiating the entire planet. And he talks about the difference between the worldview of old classical biology, since he's a biologist, which in classical biology the concern is for the whole cell. So there's an understanding of ecosystems, there's an understanding of a sense of biodiversity with this particular kind of take and view in relationship. But with something like molecular biology, which the military is very concerned about and interested in developing which we have genetic engineering and DNA and so on. That's a very different kind of mode of intelligibility that takes over, and it targets discrete elements and it takes them out. It kind of rips them out of a larger ecosystemic relationship. So biodiversity was not something that was interesting to them at the time. That wasn't, say, target oriented. It wasn't a matter of ballistics, which is what the military is mostly concerned with ultimately. But now, it's very odd to see how the apocalyptic narrative is now infiltrating the idea of biodiversity, which, in my mind, is one of the key struggles to be waged at this moment, since we're losing so many species. We're in the midst of a large planetary species loss. But it's interesting to see how biodiversity has become a new kind of security strategy. There's people like Rafe Sagarin, who wrote Learning from the Octopus, which came out just about 2 or 3 years ago. And before that, he worked with this security specialist. His name was Terrence Taylor. Taylor is a former chief inspector during the Bush administration of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And Taylor was one of the people that when the weapons of mass destruction could not be found, he promoted the idea that they were possibly mobile and being moved around all the time. So the two of them put together a book called Natural Security, where they recharacterized the entire history of biological development, natural nature itself, as a process of risk, where organisms survive because they adapt, because they're very attuned to diversity, and diversity now becomes a security mechanism. You are concerned about the diversity because you know how to secure your environment. And that, to me, is really interesting.
Well, and I think it fits perfectly with how that would grow out of what Jake is talking about in these developments. And you mentioned the apocalyptic narrative of biodiversity, and I see it all the time on Twitter. It can be quite depressing, actually, to read Twitter, because you see a lot of the apocalyptic narrative of, everything's going away. It's all being lost. And of course, that's at base, that's what this book is about narrative, about a narrative structure and how that became dominant and how it flows into other structures, or at least that's what he's trying to do. At the birth of catastrophic environmentalism, as a way of seeing the world. What do you think about catastrophic environmentalism as a way of seeing the world? Is that the world we're in now? Is it, Dave?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends on who you ask, right? Right? Just like it depended on who you asked in 1970, right? About sort of this is the sort of human imprint on the world such degree that it's ultimately going to crumble, right? So I do see strands of it, right? The sort of apocalyptic narrative of that humans have impacted the world to such a degree that there's no turning back. But I'm also, for me, I'm interested in sort of the sort of legacy of the sort of, Ehrlich's and the population bomb debate of the early 1970s. And I think Jake does a really good job about it, how this sort of narrative, one, emerges, and then two, to sort of think about its impact, particularly since the sort of the ways in which they envision the future world hasn't materialized to the degree they did, right? So it sort of it embedded this sort of false narrative, right? That the world's going to end now, and here's why. And then what happens when the world doesn't end, right? What happens when the things that, the population bomb doesn't go off to the degree that Ehrlich was talking about? I think this has, and then sort of, Al Gore's work, and then in the 90s and early 2000s. I think these kinds of stories are alarming, but they're also, politically can be troubling in the sort of sense that, most Americans don't believe that global warming is caused by humans, right? That how do you sort of engage in a sort of political debate, or engage in a sort of political and scientific conversation that is serious, that is alarming, but doesn't fall into the same sort of old trope that the world's ending, right? And I think Jake does a really sort of interesting job of sort of weaving that sort of narrative, how that sort of apocalyptic narrative moves through the 70s and into the 80s. But I think we're still sort of living in that sort of the constraints of what happened with those debates today.
What do you think, Robert?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question in the sense that one has to guard against the way that certain forces will use apocalyptic narratives for their advantage. So, the kind of turning of biodiversity into an issue of terrorism. I mean, there are people that in the military that are now characterizing climate change as the next war that America will have to handle in terms after terrorism. So there's that concern in terms of transforming of large-scale problems into the apocalyptic. So in my mind, it's a question of how to get this information out. And we are dealing with large-scale information. We are dealing with transformations in the environment that are global. And so in a sense, it touches on issues that would have been thought of as apocalyptic. But at the same time, we have to kind of take them out of the way that apocalyptic narratives are turned on their heads, so that it only leads to more and less open-minded relationships to the environment. In one case, this question of the apocalyptic, it has to do with the way in which, say, people in privileged positions, first world, in the north, global north, in the global west, that don't really have to deal with environmental catastrophe. There's a sense, like Dave, you said, that there's no real belief on the part of so many Americans that climate change is global, that it's actually happening, and that it's human-induced, that we're in the midst of the Anthropocene. But people living in third world communities are actually going through this So that islands are disappearing, shores are disappearing. Bangladesh is going to be is in the midst of doing climate change. There's an interesting. If you look online, you can Google to see who believes in climate change, and you'll get a kind of graph that will show most of the people on the rest of the planet actually know that climate change is occurring, and then they're in the midst of experiencing it. They have to handle climate change. So their environments are already changing, and this has been going on for some time. But so the apocalyptic narrative is a question that actually concerns the first world peoples. And in this sense, someone like Rob Nixon's work in Slow Violence, the idea that we only are paying attention when information is sensationalized. So there's a difference then between getting information out about there is going, the polar ice caps are melting, we're going to see an increase in water, and then so that is very different from saying something like we're going to see droughts, we're going to see massive sea level rise. There was an interesting report in Scientific American about 2 years ago where they were talking about the way in which the military was listening and paying attention to all the factual information that scientists were giving them, but they didn't like the narratives that scientists were giving them. They wanted narratives that would push it more to make climate change if there was, say, a sea level rise of 1 to 3 meters, push it to 9 meters, push it to the ultimate, most terrifying outcome. And then that's when people begin to think, this is not believable, or if it is believable, then we need to go to a kind of militarized mentality in order to handle the situation, instead of thinking how to change the way that we relate to the environment.
Well, and that example just fits so well, of course, what he talks about, because I can totally see the military in 1960 doing that exact same thing, which is about this limits and limitlessness. And I'm glad you brought up, Robert, about the first world mentality of this catastrophic discourse versus actual catastrophe, and who it is who suffers, because I think that's a really important point that often gets missed in the discussions. Dave, did you have a comment about that?
Yeah, no, I think Robert's right in the sort of sense that Americans or Europeans may be thinking about climate change, right? But other parts of the world are actually living climate change, right? And so how, and I think this sort of feeds back in sort of the early, one of sort of the issues of the late 20th century environmentalism, right? That it becomes this sort of the sense of what's happening to the environment in my sort of local purview, right? How it sort of gets framed in sort of a national debate, right? And then sort of what are the sort of implications of the ideas of development, right? Economic development, how it's going to affect first world countries, and what does it say about when we're started talking about development and economic prosperity, where does that leave countries in the global south, right? Right? And part of this is sort of the 1960s development program, right? Building dams and factories in many ways to mimic the sort of economic philosophies espoused by Europeans and Americans. And so at a particular moment in time where the sort of issues of climate change, right, of economic, and what's causing it, right, sort of the burning of fossil fuels, how does that sort of get played out in other parts of the world, in the global south, right, who are struggling, in many parts are struggling, who don't have the sort of necessary infrastructure or infrastructure in place to deal with issues of climate change, and in relationship to this sort of questions of both economic questions and also environmental questions.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch how, especially in the American context, when there's not a real strong environmental political party, so there's a vacuum there, And
Right.
when an organization that's devoted to action, like the military, steps in, and I mean, there are many, it's, in some ways, it's kind of, for the purposes of having just a quick interview like we're doing now, I mean, it's easy to homogenize the military because there are many people that think differently about
Mm-hmm.
it.
Oh, absolutely.
And there are some ways that this can be productive in getting the word out. But at the same, because we don't have large platforms for getting the word out about the environment, platforms that are productive, because we see enough in TV, we see enough in the media about it, but at the same time, that's not trusted and it's not considered to be a reliable source. So when a major vehicle of action like the military steps in, the real danger then becomes the idea that this is just a neutral way of dealing with the situation. And so what has to be, what I think we really need to pay attention to are the particular answers that are being handed over in terms of how we address the situation. So, I mean, the question of the future of the planet, the future of humans' relationship to the planet, to the environment, how we think about ourselves, biodiversity, species loss, etc. All these are questions that have many different, that are many different problems, demand many different solutions, demand many different ways of thinking from many disciplines. And that the discipline that is primary, or the vehicle that is primarily a source of action, like the military, we should be paying very close attention to the answers that are being handed over, to the ways that the situation is dealt with, because this is not a situation that's going to be merely about security. If it is boiled down to security, then it's going to be a real problem. It'll be a problem of more walls being put up in gated communities, walls around borders of nations, as we have millions and millions of people that are going to become climate change refugees. Nixon talks about that.
Mm-hmm.
So this is something that needs to be kept in mind.
Absolutely, and nothing is neutral. And so we'll wrap up for today. Thank you all again for talking about Arming Mother Nature, the birth of catastrophic environmentalism. Thanks to Dave and Robert, and we hope that
Thank you.
everybody will enjoy. Can you enjoy reading this book? Yes, enjoy.
You can
reading this book,
but it's a tough subject matter. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both.